talk to you a little bit about some of the reasons why accessibility is important. I'm also going to give you a few examples of features that you can implement in your games. But first I'm going to explain a little bit about what accessibility actually is. And to do that, I'm first going to explain a little bit about what disability actually is. And to do that, I have this chap here to help me. So looking at this picture, I'm sure most of the people in the room would be able to have some kind of a guess about what this gentleman's disability is. So what that actually is that's making him disabled. So you might, for example, be thinking about perhaps he has cerebral palsy. In which case, you'd be correct in that he has cerebral palsy. However, cerebral palsy is not actually a disability. Cerebral palsy is a medical condition, and that's a really important distinction to make. So what else could it be then? You might be thinking about his wheelchair, but again, a wheelchair isn't a disability any more than a pair of glasses are a disability. It's a piece of technology that actually helps him go about his day. And he was going about his day just fine until he went to meet his friends in this bar and encountered the steps. And that's what disability is. It's when someone's medical condition encounters some kind of a barrier that causes difficulty going about a day-to-day task. And these kind of barriers, whether it is some steps into a bar, whether it's a shelf that's too high, whether it's red and green teams in a deathmatch, these kind of barriers are generally put there by someone. You know, someone actually designed it to be like this. Which is a bit of a heavy thing to get your head around, that as designers, as developers, we actually cause people to be disabled. But there is the flip side to that as well, which is that through being aware of what kind of barriers there are, we can actually work to avoid them or remove them. And it's that process that's known as accessibility. And there's all kinds of reasons why it's an important thing to think about, but there's two main big ones that I'm going to talk about today. The first one being the human benefit. So what games actually represent is access to culture, to recreation, to socialising. And these are all things that so many of us take for granted, right? But if for any reason your means of accessing those things is in some way restricted in day-to-day life, that then means that games, any games at all, can be a really powerful contributor to your quality of life. And then the other reason is a bit more mercenary. It's just cold hard cash. Because the statistics on disability are quite staggering. So I mean, the official government statistics are around 18% of the population. And that's just what falls under kind of the traditional definitions as well. That doesn't include colour blindness, 8% of males. Difficulty reading, about 14% of adults, depending on the country. So whichever way you cut it, there's big numbers involved, which translates into big markets, which translates into money to be made, money to be lost. And if you think about it, early enough in development, there is a lot that you can do very, very easily, very, very cheaply, sometimes even for free. Something like deciding not to use a small font costs you nothing. So I'm going to give you a few examples of the kind of things that you can take into account. And it may at first seem a bit intimidating, you know, all these various different kinds of disabilities and stuff, but actually there's only 4 broad groups that apply to mobile. So you have vision, ability to see, you have ability to hear, ability to take in and process information, and lastly, ability to control the device. There's also speech as well, but that doesn't really factor into mobile very much. So I'm going to give you just a few quick examples. I'm also going to give you a resource at the end that you can go to learn more as well. So starting with vision. Now, the first thing that generally comes into people's heads when you think about difficulty seeing is blindness. And actually blind gaming is a big thing. On iOS in particular, there are hundreds of games that are completely accessible to people who are completely blind. And it's quite often due to software like this. So this is called VoiceOver, it's on iOS. There's also equivalents on Windows Phone and on Android as well. So basically any smartphone, any tablet has got a setting you can flick which changes how the gestures work. So you can basically run your finger over the surface of a phone and it will speak out the label of any element that you run your finger over. So you can basically use your finger as an eye to see the layout of the screen. So it's really, really cool software. However, it currently only works if you're developing natively. So it looks for the labels, the native UI elements. Engines don't currently, emphasis on currently, support it, but it's worth still mentioning. What I actually wanted to talk to you about for vision was something slightly different, because actually most people who have got difficulty seeing aren't blind. Even most people who are blind do still have some residual amount of vision left. The reasons for this cover, a wide range of conditions. So things like, with that chair there. So things like glaucoma, cataracts, astigmatism, all kinds of different conditions, but they all come up against the same kind of barriers, which are relating to size and relating to contrast. And what I've got here is an example of what not to do. So this is a game called Epic Eric, which a friend of mine made. He loves me going around talking about his game being a bad example. So anyway, basically this mechanic is based on the little knight in the bottom left swinging in between the cogs. And you can already kind of see that even on this big screen, it's not really that clear what you're supposed to be doing. And then if you add even a moderate amount of impaired vision, it becomes more difficult again. And actually, I'm sure plenty of you play games under these circumstances, because this doesn't just relate to physically impaired vision. Now, this is also what a game looks like if you play it on a tiny screen in direct sunlight when the phone's on power saving mode. And that's something you really, really commonly see with accessibility, is the kind of considerations you make for some physically impaired group actually helps to avoid barriers for all these other kind of situational and temporary conditions as well. So, this was early in development. He realised this was an issue, and this is actually what he ended up with by the end. So you can see everything is much, much clearer. In particular, really, really easy to see which things you're supposed to be interacting with versus which things you aren't. And then he actually took it a step further again and implemented this. So what this is basically he just inserted a rectangle in between the foreground and the background. And up the top right there, you can see there's a slider. So you can basically tint that rectangle from transparent all the way to black, all the way to white, and actually configure the contrast. And that feature took him 15 minutes to implement, almost all of which was just trying to get that slider to work. So there are a few other examples of games that do this kind of configurable contrast, but that's really kind of the pinnacle. Even if you just concentrate on this kind of stuff, make sure that things are decent size, decent contrast, then loads more people are going to be able to have an enjoyable experience with your game. So next, hearing. There's one particular aspect of hearing accessibility that I'm going to talk about, which is subtitles or captions, depending on which country you're from. Now, people use captions for all kinds of reasons. The obvious one being essential if you can't hear, but also the game might have an unpredictable sound mix. English might not be your first language, so you find accents difficult. You might be in a noisy room, on a cheap tablet with tinny speakers. You might be on public transport on a mobile device with no headphones. So all these kinds of different reasons why people rely on them. So it's not really a surprise to see data like this. Now this was completely unscientific, it was just a straw poll on CNET, but things you see from other sources, just other straw polls on NeoGAF and that kind of stuff, it paints a similar kind of picture. Now because subtitles and captions are so commonly used, and because they can make such a difference to someone's experience, obviously they justify having time spent on them. They justify being done well. Which is a shame, because they aren't. Universally, across the games industry, compared to other industries, subtitles are really, really bad, and I do mean in your games as well. Which is kind of a bold claim to make, but it's not me who's making this claim. So this is a few quotes just from a single thread on NeoGAF. So you can get a general idea, right? So gamers generally aren't very happy at all about the state of subtitles in games. But the thing is, it's not rocket science. You know, the two most common things that people complain about, you know, sometimes it's pacing, stuff like that, but the two most common things are them being too small and not being able to distinguish them properly from the background. And those two things are really, really easy to fix. So this is what you're aiming for. So you can see here, this is from a game called Bertram Fiddle, and you can see here it's using a clear, easy to read font in mixed case rather than full capitals, which is really important as well. Decent size and really, really clearly distinguished from the background as well. So this is what you should be aiming for as a base level. And I say base level because actually there are different use cases for subtitles. So you have some people who are completely deaf, who rely entirely on subtitles for their understanding of the game. They need them to be as bold and clear as possible so they never miss a single word. Then at the other end of the scale, you have people who can hear just fine, but have the subtitles up just to glance at occasionally in case they miss a word because an explosion's going off at the time, something like that. At that end of the scale, people want their subtitles to be unobtrusive. So actually, each one of these three examples is the desired optimal option for a certain group of people. So, what do you do? Which one do you choose? Was a pretty simple answer to that. You don't have to. This is a digital medium. You can just give people a choice. And this is what is done as standard in other industries. So if you look at YouTube, Netflix, they all offer options to customize the appearance of the subtitles. Now we're actually starting to see a couple of games now that are starting to introduce these kind of options. So games like Walking Dead and Life is Strange are starting to offer a choice over size, but it's still really rare. So if you want to be at the real pinnacle of innovation in the games industry, allow that black rectangle to be turned on or off. And that'll make a lot of people happy. So next, motor. So that's the last area that I'm going to talk to you about today. And when you're designing for mobile, it's really, really easy to fall into the trap of thinking that someone has a mobile device, they must be able to do all the standard mobile-y kind of things, right? But actually that's not the case. So this guy, for example, this is quite a common setup. He can see he has his tablet mounted in a fixed position on his wheelchair. So he can actually do pretty much everything on that tablet, but he can't use the gyroscope. Next, this chap. So he is using a head pointer. So you can see basically it's a stylus attached to his head. So again, he can do loads and loads of stuff on that tablet. And it's a really, really empowering device for him as well. However, he's unlikely to be doing many simultaneous multi-touch gestures. And then, of course, you have all the temporary and situational things as well. So you might have someone who can only play with one hand because they have a broken arm, or because they're holding onto a handrail on the train, or because they've got a beer in their hand. Also somebody who can't manage to hit small interface elements because they're playing in a bumpy bus, all those kind of things as well. So what can you do about that? Well, the first thing is to avoid unnecessary complexity, and the keyword there is unnecessary. So if your game really, really does require you to have 5 fingers on the screen at once, that's totally fine, but just always think, is that really necessary? Could that be simplified? Could there be some alternative option? Then the other side of it is offering some degree of flexibility. So in console land, flexibility of controls generally means button remapping. So people can't physically reach some location on a controller, let them move the buttons around. On mobile, it means something slightly different. So this is basically your equivalent of button remapping on mobile. And this is from a game called Need for Speed. I'm sure plenty of you played this. So the reason why they've come up with this design is because this is a game out of Melbourne, and Melbourne has a tram system that's really, really busy and crowded. So they wanted players playing on that tram system to be able to play in whatever cramped up position they ended up in. So you can start your gestures from anywhere, top to bottom, left to right, in the entire left-hand half of the screen for your steering. Same thing with the other controls, you've got the entire top to bottom, any point at all you can start your movement from. So you can control it in all kinds of different methods. As I said, this was developed for people who are using it on public transport. But actually I spoke to somebody last year who has really profound motor impairment. He loves games, he can't play on a console, he doesn't have the physical strength to operate a controller. He can't sit up, he is lying on his back. The only way he can interact with the game is to lie on his back, prop a tablet up on his stomach, and hold it by the top corners. he can play this game. So you can see all those controls can be operated along the top half. So that actually makes Need for Speed one of the few games that he can play, which makes it one of the few means of independent recreation that he has in his life. So all of a sudden that makes this game really, really life-changing. There is also another side to flexibility. So has anyone here played this game? Yes, there's a couple of nods. Cool, so this is a game called Into the Dead. It's basically an endless runner where you're running through a field of zombies trying to dodge in between them. And this is the selection of options they provide. So, for the vast majority of the development process, there was only one option, which was tilt. Because the designers had considered all these different options. The new tilt was going to be the most fun. It's the one they found the most fun. So they just had that. But right at the very end of development, their user researcher persuaded them to include these other options for accessibility. Like those guys I showed before, it's people who can't physically operate a gyroscope. So the rest of the team were like, okay, yep, fair enough, we'll put those in. They put them in. But obviously, as they knew, tilt is the fun one. So they're expecting, maybe 90% of people to use tilt. Just the fraction of people who really couldn't use tilt would use the other ones. And then they tracked the data. The data they got for each of those control methods was 25, 25, 25, 25. Well, like 26, 24, that kind of thing. So basically, what they thought was going to be an effort to include a tiny niche percentage of their audience had actually made the game a more enjoyable experience for the 75% of their players who actually preferred not to use tilt. So that's as much time as I've got for examples, but this is a free resource. It's gameaccessibilityguidelines.com. If you have a look on there, it has all kinds of other examples. So things like colour blindness, dyslexia, all that kind of stuff. And I have one last thing before I go, which is a bit of audience participation, because I know how much everybody loves that. But it won't be painful, I promise. I'd just like to see a show of hands. I'd like you to raise your hands if you are planning on giving up playing games by the time you reach the age of 65. No takers? No. Okay, so the reason I'm asking that is because those figures I was talking about at the beginning, that like 18-20%, when you're over 65, that number is 50%. So by thinking about this kind of stuff, you're not only helping your bottom line, not only helping people's quality of life, you're helping the industry put in place design practices now that will allow all of us to keep on playing as we get older. Thank you.
Awesome as ever. I think I've got to give you guys a chance to at least ask a question. Anyone got a question you want to ask?
So what have you found for wearable technology with gaming, or accessibility?
For wearable technology, all I've really thought about for wearable technology has been VR, which presents all kinds of interesting opportunities and barriers, which is the same with any kind of new tech. It's the same with touchscreens, the same with Kinect gestures, that kind of stuff. So for VR, basically, it's the same kind of things I was talking about, providing options, So the optimal way, what the designers think is fun, may well be using 2 Vive controllers, but that relies on somebody having 2 working arms, 2 working hands, and a full set of working fingers. So if there could be some other kind of option that you could provide, allow people to play with a controller, something like that. The other side, from the opportunities, you've got things like giving the option to someone to control using, I'm just trying to think of the name, Land's End? So if anyone's played Land's End, like the control method in that, where you look around and just use dwell to move around the environment. That means people who can't use their arms at all have now got the opportunity to interact solely using their head. So it's basically those 2 sides of it. Yeah.
Cool, and because we're a little behind, I'll have to carry on, but thank you very much. Never fails to deliver in terms of getting people to think about this kind of stuff, and I'm glad to have him with us. So
cool. If anyone's got any more questions, just hit me up afterwards.